The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Seif. I'm the Policy Outreach Coordinator at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm very excited to be talking to you all today about our fantastic new report, the State of Homelessness in America 2013. In addition to discussing some of the highlights of the report, we'll also be talking about ways to use the report to attract local media attention to the issue of homelessness. So on behalf of everyone here at the Alliance, I want to thank you all for joining us on this call. We're really excited about collaborating with you on this campaign. Start the slideshow. And before we get started, I did want to remind everyone that all the lines will be muted during the webinar, but if you do have any questions at any point, you can send them to us through the webinar software. So just go ahead and type them into the chat box labeled questions on your webinar control panel, and we'll have time at the end of the webinar to answer as many of your questions as we can. Also, we will try and post a recording of the webinar on our website, hopefully this afternoon or at some point tomorrow, so we should have that up there soon. So in addition to me today, you'll be hearing from my colleague, Samantha Batko, who is the Director of the Homelessness Research Institute, and Jeni Gamble, the Alliance's Director of Development and Communications. The main goal of today's call is to discuss how to collaborate on getting local media coverage on the issue of homelessness by using the report as a catalyst sort of for your interactions with local newspapers and reporters. After Samantha overviews the report, you're going to hear from Jeni about developing key talking points, important media strategies, and helpful tips for successfully using this report to help leverage media attention on homelessness. Finally, I will be discussing how we can use the report and the accompanying media coverage to raise awareness among policymakers, and then any policy implications the information in the report may have. Lastly, we will have plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So again, please submit any questions you have in the chat box labeled questions on your webinar control panel. Once the webinar is over, I will be sending out some sample editorials, letters to the editor, and email pitches, so right after the webinar is over, to anyone who's registered, so you can get started on getting some media. So with that, we'll start the webinar off with Samantha, who will review the content of the report itself. She's going to talk about the structure of the report and its major findings. Sam?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Kate said, my name is Samantha Batko, and I'm the Director of the Homelessness Research Institute here at the Alliance. And I'm going to be going over some of the major findings in today's report. The first thing that I'm going to go over is the background of the report, and this report is not the first of its kind, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between this report and some of the ones that come out of HUD. I'm also going to go over the major findings of the report and some of the exciting, or not so exciting, multi-year trends that we have found. And then lastly, I'm going to just do some quick key takeaways that you will be able to use as we move forward into the discussion of media and advocacy. So to start with, background, the State of Homelessness in America. This is the third report in the series. This report originated, and we looked at homelessness trends and economic trends and some demographic trends. The way that this report is the same is that we still looked at the trends in homelessness, and we still looked at economic and housing factors, but we changed up which economic and housing factors we looked at a little bit, and also we looked at some new demographic factors. In addition, this report has some great multi-year trends that we'll look at later on. So it's important to note when you look at the report that homelessness is a lagging indicator. So while the economy is beginning to recover, as you'll see, a number of the other elements that impact homelessness are still worsening. And additionally, to give you some context for how this fits into some of the reports that HUD releases, our homelessness data that we looked at are from the point-in-time counts. And so we did look at the 2011 and 2012 point-in-time counts, just as HUD has released the 2011 and 2012 point-in-time counts. But we did not look at annual numbers. So when you're comparing it to HUD's AHAR that they just released in November, which has the 2011 annual numbers, these numbers will seem significantly smaller because they are not for an entire year. So quickly, the report contents. There are 3 chapters in the report. The first one covers homelessness. The second one looks at economic and housing factors, and the third one looks at demographic factors. The data sources for the entire report are the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the National Association of State Budget Officers. So quickly, I'm going to go through chapter by chapter to look at the major findings in each chapter. And so the first chapter, like I said, is on homelessness. And the data that's presented in Chapter 1 all come from the point-in-time estimates for January 2011 and January 2012. And we use the numbers directly as they were reported from communities to HUD. We didn't make any corrections to any numbers. So whatever was reported from each COC is what we use in the report. A little bit of context for why we chose to use point-in-time counts and why we have in the past is that point-in-time counts are the only data source that capture both the sheltered and the unsheltered homelessness populations in every community in the country. We know that there are limitations on this data. We know that this is not a count of every single homeless person in the country. But even though there are changes in methodology and frequency, these provide the best way to longitudinally look for trends in the progress that we make in ending homelessness. As you can see on the chart that's on your screen right now, nationally, homelessness remained about the same. It decreased by less than 1%, but it doesn't provide a full picture. You'll see that veteran and chronic homelessness both decreased significantly, and on the other hand, family homelessness has increased slightly. On this next slide, what you're going to see is a map of the United States, and I want to point out some features of the map. So in the report, if you open up the report, you'll see that there's maps like this for pretty much every single measure that we looked at. And so each state has a number. So there's one for rate of homelessness, there's one for change in overall homelessness, there's one for change in veterans homelessness, there's one for change in chronic homelessness. So any subpopulation that you can think of, there's a map like this. In the Gulf of Mexico, you'll see a tiny version of the United States, and that is not a brand new landmass. That is the national rate or the national average change, and then each state is indicated within their state. So the rate of homelessness in the U.S. in 2012 was 20 homeless persons per 10,000 people in the general population. And despite the previously mentioned decreases in veteran homelessness, the rate of homelessness among veterans has remained higher than the rate of homelessness in the general population. So there are 29 homeless veterans per 10,000 veterans in the general population. Like I said, this report doesn't only provide national trends, but also state by state, as you can see here. And so, like I said, there are different maps for each one. And in the report, you'll find a map for overall homelessness. And you'll see that overall homelessness decreased nationally, but actually went up in 28 states and the District of Columbia. Similarly, chronic and veteran homelessness both decreased nationally, but they increased in 21 states and 19 states respectively. And although family homelessness in the nation has increased slightly, 25 states still did report either no change or a decrease. The last subpopulation that we looked at was the unsheltered population. So the majority of homeless people experiencing homelessness stay in emergency shelter or transitional housing. Just a little over a third of people stay in places, quote unquote, not meant for human habitation. So that includes the streets, a car, or an abandoned building. Nationally, there wasn't any change in the unsheltered population from 2011 to 2012, but 17 states did actually report a decrease. So what we say is that the mixed findings in this report show that policy changes have an impact, but that there's also important economic climate changes that are taking place and impacting these numbers. So we all know that at its root, homelessness is caused by an inability to be able to afford housing, and this is affected by two things: income, so how much money a household is bringing in, and also housing costs, how much it costs for them to be able to afford to live somewhere. The second chapter of the report is going to examine these two factors, and it looks at it from 2010 to 2011. There are a couple of reasons for that. First is that that's the most recent available data for these particular measures, and also that it's looking at the time period beforehand because, as I said, homelessness is a lagging indicator. The data for the housing and economic factors in the second chapter comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, the National Association of State Budget Officers, and then finally HUD again. So in terms of economic trends, we looked at unemployment, poverty, median household income, and
overall, we found a mixed bag. Unemployment decreased 7% nationally and in almost every single state in the country. But at the same time, poverty and median household income measures worsened, and in the vast majority of states. And then we also looked at the housing trends, like I said. And the housing trends that we looked at were fair market rent, severe housing cost burden among poor renters, proportion of renter households, and vacancy rate. Nationally, fair market rent, which for those of you that are not familiar with it, is a measure of what you would call modest rents set by HUD, so pretty much 40% of the units in a community rent at or below the fair market rent. And that increased 1.5% between 2010 and 2011, and 38 states saw an increase in rental costs. Similarly, severe housing cost burden among poor households, which means individuals and family households that are paying more than 50% of their income towards housing and are considered in the under the poverty level. That increased 5.5% from 6.2 million households to 6.5 million households. And lastly, the number of renter households increased and the vacancy rate decreased. So essentially what you're seeing is a larger number of people trying to rent and a fewer number of available units, which makes it a much more tighter and competitive rental housing market. The final chapter of the report, Chapter 3, examined trends in particular populations that are at risk of homelessness. So doubled-up households living in poverty, single-person households in poverty, that's unaccompanied individuals essentially, and families headed by a single adult who we know from homelessness data is usually a female in poverty. The data for these measures comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. So doubling up, for the purposes of this report, refers to when a family or an individual is living in another family member's or another friend's home for economic reasons, and they're under the poverty level. This is the most often cited prior living situation for an individual in a family entering the homelessness system. Nationally, the number of doubled-up poor households increased by almost 10%, and all but 11 states saw an increase. The other two factors that we looked at in this chapter was the majority of the homeless population is comprised of single unaccompanied adults, so that's our individual population, and homeless families are most often headed by a single adult, like I said, usually female. And both of these populations under the poverty level increased from 2010 to 2011. A unique feature in this year's report is an examination of some multi-year trends in each chapter. It's a little difficult to see on this chart because the scale is so large because it includes the overall population, but the decreases that we saw in veteran and chronic homelessness are a part of multi-year trends of decreases within this population. And they show how when there is targeted federal intervention, we can see progress. The second multi-year trend that we looked at was a combination of income and fair market rent. And you can see great on this chart right here how over the past, well, between 2007 and 2011, median household income went down over 8% and fair market rent went up over 15%. And that the juxtaposition of those two things shows you exactly the squeeze that families are feeling and individuals are feeling. And the housing market has become much less accessible and much less affordable. The last multi-year trend that we looked at were demographic trends. And here you can see the increase in doubled-up households, the increase in poor single-person individuals, and poor family households that are headed by a single adult. And that those increases that we saw in the year 2010 to 2011 are part of a much larger trend of increases amongst those populations. The bright red line that you see there is probably the most striking increase in the past 5 years, and that is the number of poor adults accessing safety net benefits, which has gone from about 4 million in 2007 to over 15 million in 2012. So this report looks at the number of adults accessing safety benefits in the context of a broader examination of the social safety net. And it's not really clear whether or not changes in social spending or accessing the safety net is a protective factor or a risk factor for entering homelessness. But what it does show us overall is that there's increased need and an increased number of eligible populations. So there may be additional need for additional resources for essential needs for these households. So some final notes. I would recommend that everyone read the report. It's available online on the Alliance's website. If you don't have time to read the full report, at least read the executive summary and look up your own state and use that information that's in the report for advocacy in order to ask for more resources to help these vulnerable populations. Additionally, in the appendix of the report, all of the data sources are listed so you can go and find information about your community specifically, not just your state. And within the appendices, there are also tables for each state that have the breakdown for each state in their economic, housing, and demographic trends that I just discussed for the national level. So before I hand it over to Jeni, I want to quickly go over some of the key takeaways from the report and some of the messaging that we're using when we talk about it. So there's good news and bad news in the report. The good news is that homelessness remains stable overall despite worsening economic, housing, and demographic factors. And we think that's because of the presence of the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, more commonly known as HPRP, and also the federal investment in permanent supportive housing and in veteran homelessness. So as we've seen federal investment in programs, we've seen progress in ending homelessness, and we really think that HPRP helped prevent the family numbers from going up during this time period, immediately during the recession and immediately following the recession. The good news, significant decreases in chronic and veteran homelessness. The bad news, though, is that incomes are continuing to decrease and rental housing has become more expensive and scarce, which just means that lower income populations, lower income individuals, and lower income families have more competition when trying to get into units and are going to be facing higher rents, which makes it less accessible to them. Also, we continue to see an increase in the doubled up population, which we know is a population that's particularly at risk of entering homelessness. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeni.
Great. Thank you, Sam. My name is Jeni Gamble, and I'm the Director of Development and Communications for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for this important release and to review these results and some strategies to use this data in your own community. I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking through some of the targeted activities that advocates and organizations can take to engage and utilize the State of Homelessness data to gain media traction and to really incorporate themselves in a lot of ways with the data to tell a stronger story, basically. And just as a reminder, we're going to be posting a recording of this webinar probably this afternoon, this evening, and we'll also be distributing the materials and a copy of the PowerPoint. So as Sam said, there are a number of key messages, and not to repeat all of hers, but homelessness overall has held stable, and which is a very important thing to remember and to consider as the state of our country and our economy. We have seen both chronic and veteran homelessness decrease, and we attribute those decreases to those federal investments. And then again, we have unfortunately seen a slight increase in family homelessness. So these are some overall sort of like high-level messages that are important, and we just really want to take home. The next element of key messages is really sort of investing in what works. So as Sam said, we really believe and know that HPRP held off those increases in homelessness despite the recession, despite the difficult economic times. Investing in those solutions can produce measurable results, and those results require capital. And so that message moving forward, and sort of as a compelling statement, is that we know what works, and we know that investing in rapid rehousing works, and more investment is needed. So those resources are the resources that we want to continue to be strong and vocal advocates for. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about a couple of different strategic directions, both with traditional media as well as with digital media, and using your own resources, your websites, your social media, our social media, to move these messages forward. Now, in terms of traditional media, there are a number of vehicles that you can use to include the State of Homelessness data as part of your organization's position, to demonstrate new needs for the future, to talk about your current programming efforts, fundraising activities, all of those things. Incorporating this data really makes your message incredibly strong. And there are a number of motivations that people have. Sometimes those motivations can be by the compelling story, and couple that with strong data, and the message itself gets stronger. So when you look at these traditional media outlets, we have letters to the editor, op-ed submissions, and those first two, I think that it's important for us to consider that some of the best authors for letters to the editor and for op-eds, they can be board members, your executive director. Those are going to be individuals who are informed and hold a concerned position. So they're informed of the issue itself, and they're concerned due to their role. So, let's say as an example would be a board member who perhaps is a business owner in your community. This individual writing a letter to the editor and talking about the state of homelessness data nationally, tying that back to local and state data, that can be very compelling when talking about new programmatic efforts that are underway. So, an organization that has really been moving towards rapid rehousing, their board member can talk about this move and what that has meant for the community and tying that to the data. They can draw comparisons. How does the state measure up to the national averages, and where has the state's data gone? Has it gone up, gone down? Some of those different percentages, as Sam mentioned, there are a lot of different measures, and there's a lot of data that you can look at to really understand the shifts that are occurring in your community. So that data is really important to include, and when it's someone who can be a strong voice, they are likely to get some response when it comes to sending in a letter to the editor or an op-ed. When it comes to pitch emails and phone calls to reporters and press releases, a lot of this is building relationships, but they're really important to put forth. It's so essential to make those connections and to reach out and to develop the relationships. And I'm going to be talking about some real real specific tactics that you can use, particularly with emails and phone calls, a little bit later on. So these are just some of the ways to kind of get your foot in the door with some traditional media. Next, we're going to talk about digital, website, social media, all of those different mediums that we've all we've seen incredible growth in, and we've all tried to figure out how our message can best be communicated using these mediums. Now, when it comes to digital and your own website, one of the most effective things that you can do is to include your state data on your website. Depending on your content management system, this can typically be accomplished really quickly. Adding a page and saying, homelessness in, your state. So including that information and then linking that to the state of homelessness at the Alliance can be really helpful, and it also gives any kind of reporter, any kind of media person the source of the data. A big mistake that a lot of organizations can make is to put on their website information and data and numbers, but not say where it came from. And so that kind of calls into question at times, like, where did this come from? So this way, your source is out there. You can also, use this data in your newsletters. If you have an organizational blog that goes out to your audience, to your stakeholders, if you have board reports, use this information to really help your stakeholders understand the shifts that are occurring in homelessness and how your state compares nationally, and what you're doing to participate in this movement and in this work and truly bring an end to homelessness. When it comes to social media, we know that social media is a lot of activity, and understanding the yield of those activities can sometimes be confusing. I think we all kind of question what is the takeaway with some of it. But we do know that people are listening and people are paying attention and people share things. And so a couple of the strategies that we have found to be really helpful is to, we blog. So the Alliance has a blog. You can share our blog places, as well as reaching out to some of your local bloggers to connect this information with some of your state trends and to national information. And I also definitely make sure that everyone knows that the Alliance has a very active Facebook presence, Twitter presence, and that we are retweeting and posting and putting this data out there, and that we really encourage you to repost, retweet, and use what we're putting out there to your benefit and to reach your stakeholders as well. So we know that these things are sometimes you've got a lot going on with all these different kinds of digital media, but they're very important to stay active with. So those are just a couple of different strategies in that way. As Sam spoke about the multi-year trends and some of the things that we know are happening, some of the bigger opportunities when it comes to the data in State of Homelessness come from those economic indicators and demographic drivers. And I say that because those are new stories. This is new data. We analyze this information and make it available so that states can apply it, and homeless service providers and all the advocates out there in the field can take this information and and use it to their benefit. So when you look at this information, know that this is new. And the two questions on the bottom, what are your goals and priorities for this year, and what's the most interesting finding in your community? You know your communities best. So if unemployment is the hugest issue in your community, look at unemployment and look at those factors and look at that data and see where the connections are. We saw the one graph with the big red line going up with the changes in poor households accessing safety net benefits. Those are big stories, and connecting that to your work can be very helpful. Now, when you talk about goals and priorities for this year, I encourage you to think about, are your goals, I'm just going to list off a couple, major placement in your traditional news outlet. Are your goals really getting strong coverage for a specific event? Maybe you're launching a project, a capital project. Are they to develop relationships with specific media outlets? Maybe you want to develop 3 strong relationships this year, or you want to increase the visibility of a specific program or need or issue. Look at these economic indicators and look at these demographic drivers that are in the state of homelessness as tools for you, because they can reinforce your message, they can reinforce your position that you as a program, as an organization, are working towards fixing this problem or towards changing the situation. So those are just a couple of different things to consider. And again, the multi-year trends are really powerful and can really make a difference in terms of how you tell your story. The next couple of slides are statements, and these are just statements that we have crafted. Feel free to use them, that are speaking to specifically populations, but are speaking to how those populations and those that are experiencing homelessness, what we're finding. So when it comes to veterans and chronic, both chronic and veterans homelessness have decreased by about 7% each. These results demonstrate that SSVF and HUD-VASH and other housing-based solutions like permanent supportive housing are working. These are critical resources to ensuring we achieve the goal of ending homelessness among veterans and those experiencing long-time homelessness. So, using statements, just crafting your own statements around those that have been experiencing homelessness can be really helpful and good launching points. Families. With family homelessness and poverty rates on the rise, American families are more vulnerable than ever. We must maintain a strong safety net to ensure that all families have a place to call home and can get the help they need in order to avoid becoming homeless when times are tough. So, a family statement. Other issues, as Sam mentioned, the relationship between incomes and housing costs is pretty significant, and it's hard to really understand the impact that all of this is going to have in another 5 years. Because what we do see, as she has was speaking earlier, a tightening rental housing market coupled with falling incomes has created greater housing instability. I'm going to move on to unsheltered, but an upsetting 38% of homeless people are unsheltered. It's simply unacceptable for nearly 244,000 individuals to live on the streets in abandoned buildings, and in poverty. So using some of this data to incorporate that into your messages, we definitely encourage you to do that. In terms of taking action, we have made sure we've included a number of resources that we want to make sure are available to advocates and those out in the field. These are all going to be attached to the webinar event on the Alliance website. We'll be sending different things out. We have a press toolkit that is up that includes the state of homelessness, a number of charts and graphs. There's a data template. We're also going to be including a letter to the editor, these samples, letter to the editor, op-ed, and pitch emails. So these are resources and tools that you can use. The state data templates are there for you to plug in your state's numbers to communicate what's going on in your state, how things have changed, and what the position is in terms of how you match up to the national averages. Now the next two slides are tips, and the first slide is really about relationship building, whereas the second one is a little more about practical etiquette. And so these are really sort of the nuts and bolts approaches to media engagement and some of the practical things that can make a big difference. So first and foremost, collecting stories of housing and homelessness in your local papers, in your local news and media is going to help you understand and learn who likes to cover this issue. Who's talking about poverty, who's talking about homelessness, who's covering these stories. Those are the people that you want to be reaching out to. Make your pitch. When you're making your pitch, there's no need to dance around the topic. These folks usually have pretty tight deadlines and pretty quick turnarounds. So being direct and concise and specific really helps them to understand what it is that you're trying to communicate and that you need to communicate. Using this data, using the state and national data is, of course, I think essential to making that strong argument. And, of course, just following up with requests, sending personal emails and letting people know that you really appreciate them considering writing a story. Now, the next things are kind of the etiquette that really can help move things along a little faster. So something that can be a mistake at times is to attach a press release to an email. A lot of times those things get flagged. It is much better to include the press release text in the body of the email. You also want to be checking your subject line for spam filter buzzwords. So a good example would be urgent. So if you put urgent story in the subject line, you're probably going to get picked up by somebody's spam filter. So, and you can go out and Google and look at a number of different, resources that say, spam filter buzzwords, and you're going to get lists. But I definitely encourage you to take a look at those and make sure that you're not setting yourself up to get caught by a spam filter. Definitely link your information or your pitch to the Alliance Press Kit. It's going to make that reporter's life, it's going to make their lives a lot easier because they're automatically in touch with the source. There may have been something they were thinking of doing in terms of a story, and now they have this great resource that, opens up, and they have a local connection, So that can make a big difference. They have data in front of them. They don't have to go searching for it. And they have charts and graphs and things like that. Offering an interview or a real story, saying, we've got a board member that would talk to you. We'd love to have our executive director speak with you. Those are great things because they can get quotes and put that personal touch on things. Including a link to a photo of a chart, a graph, a person, those are great things because a lot of times when you're looking in traditional media, there is a photo there. And when a reporter already has that available, it's going to make building the story around it a lot faster, and they're not going to have to ask for so many more resources and more things. And just across the board, keep using this data. Right now, we're talking about it a lot because we just released it, but it is just as valid and it is just as important, and even more so later on in the year. We don't want this data to kind of go out of sight, out of mind because, because it's a little later on in the year and it's past the month of release. So keep using this data, and we'll do it again next year. We will have another release. So those are just some real practical tips. I hope that's been helpful. And if you have any questions, on this next slide is my name as well as Emmanuel Cavallero, who is our communications associate. We are both here as resources to help answer questions and to give you any kind of suggestions or advice that we can provide. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who is going to speak about additional advocacy.
Thank you, Jeni. And I just wanted to remind everyone that they can go ahead and submit any questions they have for Jeni, Samantha, or me as I'm talking in the questions box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. And just to remind everyone once again, we will put up a recording of the webinar online, and we'll send out the materials that Jeni was talking about along with a copy of the PowerPoint slides to you right after the webinar. So as I said earlier, I'm going to be talking to you about how you can use the report to get your message across to elected officials and other decision makers at all levels. So obviously, at this point, we've now heard what's in the report and the main messages that are going to be used nationally, as well as some tips and methods for sharing the report with local press. But I want to talk to you about why this matters and how we can use it to sort of help our advocacy work. So it's important to note that first and foremost, advocacy is about education. So education on the scope of the problem and the need, education on the solutions, and of course education about what your audience can do to help. And by audience, I could really mean anyone from your colleagues, your neighbors, your family, the general public, and of course specifically policymakers and decision makers. Even if you do nothing else with this report, I would strongly encourage you to send them a link to the report. Send it to your local, state, and federal policymakers in order to keep the issue of homelessness sort of top of mind for them. It provides an opportunity for them to see you as an expert they can turn to on the issue, and it also gives you a chance to talk about what's happening locally on the issue, both the need that exists, but also, of course, the great work being done to solve the problem. Of course, though, we are calling this a media campaign, so in addition to sending the report, we would encourage you to use this as a leverage for local media coverage, like, the letters to the editor, editorials, and pitches, as Jeni talked about. The media really works to set the tone for public awareness and sort of pushes the public debate. So if the public doesn't know about the nature and extent of the problem and the proven record of solutions, they're sort of unlikely to demand change. It's also important to note that policymakers also monitor local coverage very closely because, as we can easily guess, media outlets generally only publish things that will matter to their readers, who are also, as it conveniently turns out, also constituents and voters. In fact, a lot of members of Congress actually have what is basically sort of a Google News alert or some sort of news alert service set up so that if their name is mentioned in a news article, they'll find out about it and they'll know. So you might want to consider using a letter to the editor or a more in-depth story or op-ed to urge a specific policymaker to take a specific action. So urging a policymaker to support increased resources for a specific program. Sort of simply mentioning their name has a good possibility of getting their attention. So to discuss the policy implications of the report, the major conclusion of this report is that where federal investment has happened, such as with chronic and veteran populations, we've seen big successes. We've seen decreases among these populations. Despite more or less holding the line on homelessness for now, many other economic indicators show that increases in homelessness may be on the horizon. These indicators, coupled with sequestration and major cuts to federal housing programs, means, of course, that we need to make sure policymakers work to prioritize programs that address homelessness. The report provides us with a great opportunity to start to make the connection for policymakers, particularly those that were newly elected and arrived in Congress, in January, make the connection between the extent of the problem, its solutions, and what they can do to help. Of course, the report also helps to lay the groundwork for more direct advocacy work. And just to make a little plug for advocacy, I do want to remind everyone that the President will be releasing his budget proposal tomorrow for the fiscal year 2014, and we'll be launching our FY 2014 advocacy campaigns in a webinar on Thursday. And that's where we'll be covering a lot more of the details on what happened with sequestration, what happened with specific funding levels for specific programs and where things are going moving forward. So Sam just sent out a link to that in your chat box. So if you look at the chat box, you'll find the link to register for that. So, if you're interested in finding out more about the President's budget and these specific numbers, funding numbers for these programs, please go ahead and register. We'll, of course, be sending out more information about our advocacy campaigns and what this means for everyone in the coming weeks and months through our website, blog, and newsletters and things like that. It's important to note that while McKinney specifically may be just one of the many programs your community utilizes, McKinney Eventual Homeless Assistance Grants, the report gives us an opportunity to start to highlight the various affordable housing and homelessness resources for policymakers sort of at all levels, the federal, state, and local levels, and really the need to invest in solutions to homelessness and prioritize proven interventions for the most vulnerable people. We definitely look forward to working with you and using this as an opportunity to educate the public and policymakers on the importance of ending homelessness. So to wrap up, as a reminder, we'll post a recording of this webinar within a day or two on our website, and you'll see it right on our homepage. And this afternoon, right after the webinar ends, we'll send out the sample pitch, sample editorial, and sample letter to the editor that Jeni mentioned, along with a copy of the PowerPoint slides. And if you have any questions about those materials or you want to strategize individually, you can go ahead and contact me or Jeni. Our information's up there. You can just reply to my email. Then the next steps will, to just get started working on the op-eds, letters to the editor, and pitches to your local media. So don't forget as well to send a report to any contacts you may have in your congressional offices or with any other local officials, along with some explanations of why it's important, some of those messages that Jeni discussed. But at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Julie to help us out with some questions. Julie, do we have any questions?
Great. Thanks, Kate. Yes, we do. Okay, so the first question we have for today is for Sam. And the first question is, some states had really large increases and decreases in homelessness. Why did that happen?
So there's no definitive way to say why a particular increase or decrease happened. And I'd just like to remind people that, once again, we took the numbers directly as they were reported to HUD. We've had a couple questions about, why is this state's rate lower than this state, and it doesn't make any sense. And our report is only as good as the point-in-time counts that come in from each community. So like I said, there are changes in methodology that happen year to year. There are changes in, there are communities that don't do an unsheltered count on certain years and do the unsheltered count only when they're required to by HUD. So there are a number of things that can impact the numbers that you see there. I will say that I think that averaging them by states gives a better indication as to overall trends within a state, as opposed to being impacted by just one community's increases. But for example, the numbers went up in New York State, and we know that the numbers in New York City have gone up substantially, which may be skewing New York State in one direction as opposed to the entire state, every continuum in the state seeing increases. So there's no direct way to say, oh, your housing increased, that's why the numbers went up in your community. And I will say again that our report can only be as good as the data that we get from each community.
Great, thanks. And Sam, a few more questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
The next is, was the number of COCs across the nation that did a full point-in-time count, including both sheltered and unsheltered populations in 2012, low?
So like I said just now, the unsheltered count is only required by HUD every other year, and they're odd number years. So 2011 and 2013 were both required unsheltered count years. 2012 was not. But despite that, 67% of COCs in the country did include unsheltered counts in their count in 2012 or 2011. I'm sorry, in 2012, 67% did do unsheltered counts as well. That means that only 33% did not do an unsheltered count, and for the purposes of this report, what we did with those 33% of COCs was include their unsheltered count from 2011. So it's not perfect, and that may be contributing to the fact that there was not a significant change in the unsheltered population in the country, but 67% still did do an unsheltered count in 2012.
Great. And the next is, does the report address trends among unaccompanied minors, recognizing the limitations of counting youth in the point-in-time count?
So unfortunately, no. There was not sufficient data to be able to do that with the 2011 and 2012 numbers. Our hope is that in the coming years, the report will be able to include data on that. I think that at a minimum, in next year's report, we'll be able to include data from the communities that were included in the Youth Count initiative. If not a larger subset of COCs, I doubt that we'll be able to do the entire country, but that's not out of the question. We could still be able to do the entire country in every state. But at a minimum, I have pretty good certainty that we'll be able to include the youth count communities. And moving forward throughout the years, as those counts get more reliable, we really do feel like we'll be able to start including the unaccompanied youth. But unfortunately, no, this year we were not able to.
Great. And the next question is, are there breakdowns of the data for areas smaller than states, like New York City? And if so, where can this information be found?
There are not in our report. We did not include breakdowns of any locality smaller than a state. You can find that on HUD's pages. If you go to HUD-HRE.info, you can go to the 2012 point in time. It's essentially the 2012 AHAR Volume 1, and you can search through the data tables and find it for the homelessness trends for each continuum. You can also go to the U.S. Census Bureau, and you can do a search for each locality. So you can do it for your city or your county.
Thanks. And the next is, which benefits are included in the poor adults accessing safety net benefits category?
So the benefits that we included in that were ones that were reported to the U.S. Census Bureau. So we included food stamps and SSI, and then what the Census Bureau refers to as public assistance income, which is TANF and general assistance.
Great. And the next is, did you look at rates of homelessness among older adults?
So we didn't. The point-in-time count information does not. That's in HUD's database that we received and used for this report does not have a breakdown on age for homeless individuals. You can look at those breakdowns within HUD's AHAR, and the most recent version of that is also available on HUD-HRE.info, and that has a breakdown for sheltered adults in the year of 2011, and that would be an annual number as opposed to a point-in-time number.
Great, and we have one final question, and that is, rather than obtaining doubled up information from the census, have you considered contacting COCs about gathering this information from point-in-time counts?
So we do not do individual outreach to COCs to collect the information for this report. Like I said, we take it directly from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have not considered contacting the COCs for doubled up information. I will absolutely look into that as we move forward. Part of what I think is the difficulty in doing that is that the methodologies across the entire country would vary dramatically in how they did outreach to find doubled up populations, and even the best methodologies would probably still fall short of finding families and individual households that are in poverty living doubled up. The census has fantastic methodology. It's tried and true. It's been used for a long period of time. They have huge sample sizes that they use. I mean, there's really just no other data source that provides us with the data quality that would give us the most accurate representation of poor doubled up households in the country. So I think that that's the best one, but I'm not opposed to looking into contacting COCs further.
Okay, great. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Unless any of my colleagues have anything to add at this point, I think we're going to wrap up. But if you have any further questions regarding the content of the webinar, again, please don't hesitate to email them to the appropriate Alliance staff member. Thanks again, everyone, for joining the webinar today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Please go ahead and look out for that email that should be coming from me soon with all the materials that we talked about. We'll send out the press kit, a toolkit for engaging the press, and everything that we discussed. So it should be in your inbox soon with the email that you registered for the webinar with. And do feel free to share the report. And as Jeni and we all talked about, post it, share it on social media outlets. Just do attribute it to the Alliance when possible. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.